Hello, and welcome to my podcast where I discuss the origins of all sorts of things. I'm your host, Danny Payne, and this is On the Origin of Everything. Back by popular demand, today will be part 2 of commonly used phrases. As a recap, idioms are expressions that have a meaning that cannot be understood by the words themselves. For example, if your plans for this weekend are up in the air, it doesn't mean that you plan to skydive on Saturday. If someone says it's raining cats and dogs, you don't run outside to pet some good boys. And by the way, the expression for raining cats and dogs in Spanish, well, in Venezuela anyway, is un palo de agua, a stick of water, like a beatdown but with a stick of water. Idioms are great. They're linguistic shortcuts, but they're more than that. They paint a picture, they tell a story, and that's why they have such staying power. Today, we'll discover where more of these phrases we use all the time came from. Let's get into it. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You've heard that saying before, I'm sure. It means that you can guide someone and provide them with opportunities, but you ultimately can't force them to do anything, emphasizing the need for individual motivation. It comes from an old English proverb that stems from a practical, shared experience of working with horses. That's more of a saying than an idiom, but there are a lot of idioms that originate with horses, like for instance, beating a dead horse. Today, this phrase is used to describe futile persistence, wasting effort on a hopeless task. But it comes from a time when farmers would beat a horse to get it to move or work. If the horse was too stubborn or too sick to work, beating it would be pointless. So, beating a dead one really brings home the point of a lost cause. The earliest record of this phrase appears in some published transcripts of UK parliamentary debates from 1859. And it doesn't read, beating a dead horse, it reads, flogging a dead horse. Flogging means whipping, for all you non-British listeners like me. So, flogging a dead horse in this transcript was being used metaphorically in the same way we use the phrase today. And it's my understanding that English people still say flogging a dead horse. I love that. I'm going to start saying it that way here in the States just to throw people off. Well, you know what they say, you can't flog a dead horse. Huh? Anyway, one could begin to wonder why the phrase isn't beating a dead mule or training a dead dog. Then again, horses were everywhere, so it makes sense that the idiom would land with them. But I actually found out that dead horse was a term that predated the beat a dead horse idiom. A dead horse back in the 1600s was slang for something that had ceased to be useful. So dead horse had been around 200 years before the first recorded instance of the idiom beat a dead horse, and it's probable that the former set up the latter nicely. Alright, that's enough of that one. If I keep talking about this, it'll feel like I'm beating a dead horse, which is another way we use that phrase, isn't it? Being long-winded, continuing to talk about something after you've already made your point. It's a very useful idiom. If someone does something nice for you, maybe gives you a gift, but you react with being critical, ungrateful, or focus on the negatives, you might get told, "Hey, don't look a gift horse in the mouth, dude." This one comes from horse trading. You can tell a lot about a horse's health and age by looking in its mouth, or looking at its teeth, rather. So if someone presents you with a horse as a gift, and you immediately start inspecting its mouth, checking to see if the gift is good enough or something, it would be considered rude and ungracious. Now check this out. This proverb has been around so long that the earliest form of it is in Latin. It appears in St. Jerome's writings circa 400 CE, where he uses the Latin wording noli equidentes inspicere notali, or to inspect the teeth of a given horse, already labeling it as a vulgare proverbium or a common proverb. This means that this idiom had already circulated widely enough to be written about in the late Roman Christian period, making the expression, "don't look a gift horse in the mouth," almost 2,000 years old. As a quick side note, have you ever heard someone say long in the tooth? like he's getting a little long in the tooth for competitive skiing. It means that something is old or past its prime, and it comes from checking horses' teeth for an indication of their age and overall health. Receding gum lines are a sign of aging for horses, and people for that matter. I mentioned in the other episode that researching these idioms is really tricky because their origins are often foggy. It's hard to get information straight from the horse's mouth, meaning from the original source. But horses don't talk, so what's going on here? Well, this expression comes from horse racing betting tips. If you're betting on horses at the racetrack, getting a tip from someone who works with the horses is pretty valuable. And this phrase of straight from the horse's mouth developed as a joke, like your insider information was so good it came straight from the horse's mouth. The earliest printed example of this is from 1896 in the Reynolds newspaper in London, and by the 1920s, this phrase had gone from a horse racing joke to a metaphorical expression for getting reliable, first-hand information. Another phrase from horse racing that we use all the time is hands down. It has a couple of meanings. It can either mean without much effort, like I won the match hands down, or without question, like pizza is hands down my favorite food. This expression comes from a jockey winning a horse race with his hands down in a relaxed position, coasting through the finish line from having had such a comfortable lead. Winning hands down started out as a literal term from around the mid-1800s, and over time the phrase evolved to the figurative sense. If you win hands down too many times, you might start acting differently, and someone might call you out by telling you to get off your high horse. This one dates back to the late 14th century, when tall horses were a status symbol. Only people with military status or social status were entitled to ride the tallest horses. The phrase began as mounting one's high horse, or riding one's great horse, to describe someone acting superior or arrogant. The counter expression, get off your high horse, naturally developed, and we still use it today to tell someone to stop acting like a jerk. I'm sorry if you're tired of hearing about horses by this point, but I got a couple more horse-related idioms to cover before moving on, so you'll just have to hold your horses. This one appears in print as hold your hosses, H-O-S-S-E-S. Hosses was slang for horses. In the New Orleans Picayune, in September of 1844, this line appears. "Oh, hold your hosses, squire. There's no use getting riled nohow." So, hold your hosses was a literal command to hold the reins of your horses to halt them or keep them from going anywhere. The phrase actually remained hold your hosses up until the 1930s, when we started seeing the phrase in print as hold your horses to simply mean wait or be patient. In the world of sports, you'll often hear about a dark horse, referring to a contender who is little known or unlikely to win, but ends up exceeding expectations. This is another idiom that stems from horse race betting. Dark is figurative for unknown or obscure. If everyone places their bets on well-known, likely-to-win horses, and a lesser-known or obscure horse comes out of nowhere to win the race, that was referred to as a dark horse. The earliest use of this comes from Jackson's Oxford Journal in 1821 in the context of horse racing, but the term quickly spread to political races and other sports in the figurative sense through the 1800s. Alright, as much as I do love horses, I think that's enough horse talk for one episode. Let's take an early break, and when I come back, we'll continue with some idioms that originated with wartime language instead. Don't go anywhere. Hey folks, I want to give a warm shout out to our listeners in Canada, particularly in Ontario. There's been an organic spike in listenership in that province that we can't account for, which means that you guys found this podcast on your own. That's amazing. And it just so happens that I lived in Ontario once upon a time. I lived in Windsor, Brampton, Stratford, Kitchener, and a few other places, but my favorite was London. Niagara Falls is awesome, especially from the Canadian vantage point. Toronto is awesome, and I'm always rooting for the Raptors, no matter how bad they are. I went to a Blue Jays game in Canada's Wonderland when I was there. You guys taught me how to say toque instead of beanie, and foyer instead of foyer, and again instead of again. My Instagram handle is actually Pain Again for that reason. But my biggest takeaway from having lived in Ontario is just how freaking nice you all are. So I'm delighted that we have listeners from that specific part of Canada. I love you guys. Can't wait to go back to Ontario someday. Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to support the show any way you can by making a monthly contribution on Patreon or by sharing the show. Let's build a community of people that are curious and always learning. Now, back to the show. Has anyone ever told you that you're a little over the top? Over the top to me seemed like it was describing overfilling a container, like it's too much of something so it spills over the top. But it turns out that it comes from warfare. World War I soldiers would leave the safety of the trenches by going over the top of the trench walls to initiate an attack on open ground. Going over the top became slang for going beyond a safe limit or doing something foolishly risky. This metaphor quickly evolved to mean that something is excessive or someone is acting unreasonably. Also, in a trench war setting, once you go over the top, you've now entered no man's land. Today, no man's land is a phrase used in different ways. It can mean a land that no one owns or occupies, a land that is unknown, a land that is dangerous or lawless, or a land in the middle of nowhere. In World War I, the above-ground area between Allied trenches and enemy trenches was called no man's land, because it was land that didn't belong to you or your enemy. This deadly space that they referred to as no man's land was the source from which we got the modern meaning of an unclaimed, remote, and possibly dangerous location. But the phrase no man's land had already existed prior to World War I. It's as old as the Middle English period, possibly older than that. In the early 14th century, there was a land outside the north wall of London that was used for disposing waste and performing executions that they called Nonnemannersland. At least that's what it looks like on paper. It was probably still pronounced no man's land, but spelled the old way. There are other mentions of a no man's land from that time period used to describe a land that is outside normal ownership or jurisdiction. So when World War I happened, British soldiers already knew the phrase no man's land and applied it to the perilous space between trench systems. And now we use it a lot more casually than that, don't we? Another phrase we use all too casually is basket case. If we think someone is a little loopy, dysfunctional, or hysterical, we might call them a basket case, but the original meaning is pretty insensitive, and actually based on rumors. You see, toward the end of World War I, official statements by American hospitals denied the existence of these so-called basket cases, which were rumored to have been soldiers with quadriplegia having to be carried around in a literal basket, a basket case. The military and the Surgeon General also denied the existence of any such cases, though. When I say they denied that basket cases were real, I don't mean to sound like I'm insinuating a cover-up. It really does appear that there were no such cases, according to the most reputable sources. The term basket case sprouted purely out of legend, and almost immediately it began to take on the meaning of a person who was functionally hopeless or unable to cope. Speaking of hopelessness, we might call a hopeless situation a catch-22. How did we all come to use that phrase, catch-22, to describe a no-win dilemma, like needing experience to get a job, but you need a job to gain experience? Catch-22 comes from Joseph Heller's satirical war novel from 1961 called Catch-22. In this book, he defines a catch-22 the same way we understand it today, through a narrative where Air Force regulation stated that a pilot willing to continue flying dangerous missions was considered insane and unfit to fly, but to be relieved, they must ask to be relieved. However, if the pilot asked to be relieved, he was then determined to be sane and fit to continue flying. This paradoxical rule made it so no pilot could escape their duties. It's a lose-lose. Catch-22 refers to this trap. The book was originally going to be called Catch-18, so we all could be saying Catch-18 if the book had been released under that title. I love it when a book or a movie is so influential that the world gains a new idiom. Another example is the term Big Brother, which comes from the famous book by George Orwell titled 1984. Big Brother in his book is the personification of state power, or the leader of such an authoritarian government. It still carries that same meaning today. Big Brother is known to mean a surveillance state, a watchful, intrusive governing authority. The term gaslight is another one. It's from a movie called Gaslight from 1944, in which a guy manipulates his wife into thinking she's crazy, and it's called gaslight because he's secretly doing something in the attic that causes the gaslights throughout the house to dim, and when she questions it, he convinces her that it's all in her head. It's actually a pretty good movie. Some idioms emerge from working with horses, others from war, and some originate from literature or films, as I've covered so far. But this next one was born out of a new technology in the mid-1800s. I'm talking about Samuel Morse's telegraph. You see, early telegraph lines were strung across tree branches and poles, which was a brand new sight for people. Telephone lines wouldn't exist for another 40 years or so. These sagging lines looked like vines hanging from tree to tree, so these telegraph communication lines came to be nicknamed grapevine telegraphs. That's where we get the phrase, "I heard it through the grapevine." Today it means you learned something through rumors, gossip, or the word on the street, rather than straight from the horse's mouth. How's that for a callback? If you didn't hear it straight from the horse's mouth, and you didn't hear it through the grapevine, maybe you got a clue by seeing the writing on the wall. What writing on what wall? And why do we say, "I saw the writing on the wall," to describe a sign of impending misfortune? The origin of this idiom is biblical. In Daniel chapter 5, when King Belshazzar throws a huge party and sacrilegiously uses the sacred ceremonial goblets from the temple, an unembodied hand appears and starts writing something on the palace wall. No one is able to decipher what was written, so the king sends for the prophet Daniel to see if he can interpret the words. And Daniel's interpretation was a prophecy that Belshazzar's days were numbered, and his kingdom would be divided and conquered. That very night, Belshazzar was murdered, and the kingdom fell into the governing hands of his enemies, fulfilling the prophetic message that was written on the wall. And that's why people started using the phrase, "the writing on the wall," when describing a bad omen. The other day I ran into someone who, in reference to a mutual acquaintance, said, "Isn't he just the salt of the earth?" Of course, I understood the phrase to be a compliment, describing a person who is fundamentally good or indisputably kind. Calling someone the salt of the earth sounds like a really old saying, doesn't it? Well, it is. It's another idiom that comes to us from the biblical text. It's attributed to the very words of Jesus even. In the famous passage in Matthew chapter 5 where Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount, he tells his disciples that they are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. Why salt? Why not gold or silver or some other precious metal? Well, salt at the time was a precious commodity, essential for preserving food and preventing decay. As an incorruptible mineral that keeps meat from corrupting or spoiling, salt was associated with purity. Calling someone the salt of the earth was an extremely high compliment, implying that they were a force for preserving goodness in the world. The first English translation of this idiom appeared in the Wycliffe Bible in 1382, and it has never left the English language since. I'll close with a phrase that my buddy George likes to say all the time. Happy as a clam. I use that phrase every now and then too, and I assumed that it had to do with a clam appearing to grin ear to ear as they open their shells. Although my interpretation may have contributed to the idiom's staying power over the years, it doesn't seem to be the original meaning. It first appears in print in 1833 as happy as a clam, but just a few years later it appears as a longer version, possibly the true original version, happy as a clam at high water. Clams at low tide are exposed and vulnerable, so they're safer and happier underwater at high tide. Pretty neat. I remember back in high school, George would also always say, "Close, but no cigar," which likely comes from carnival games of skill and chance where the prize was literally a cigar. You only knocked down 4 of the 5 pins, so close, but no cigar. As I worked through this second batch of idioms, I noticed how easily they slip into our everyday speech. We have such an attraction toward them, reaching for them without even thinking. They're a linguistic tool for taking complex ideas and making them more wieldy, sure. But I think it's the social lubricant and the in-group signaling that make idioms so important to us. These phrases only work because they're communal. My poor mom listened to the first episode of these idiom origins and was fairly lost because she's not native to America. She knows a bunch of other idioms, but they're from another country, from another culture, in another language. So I really think that idioms effortlessly enter our languages and remain there for centuries because they build cultural identity and unity. And I found that understanding their origins didn't take the magic out of them. It added a layer of anthropology to the whole thing, bringing the human aspects to the surface. Language isn't static, it's always evolving. It's inherited, adapted, and shaped by history. When we use idioms, we're not just speaking efficiently, we're joining an ancient chorus, participating in a long, unbroken conversation across time. And that concludes part 2 of commonly used phrases. Good luck with this one, Mom. Sorry. Before I go, if you have any suggestions for future episodes or feel like reaching out for any other reason, please email us at info@ontheoriginpod.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you back here in a couple of weeks with another random origin. Until next time, so long. Research for this episode was done by yours truly. Music and production by Jezere Wilson. This podcast is listener supported, owned and operated by Jez and myself under the On the Origin of Everything LLC in the United States. All rights reserved. We can be reached via email at info@ontheoriginpod.com.